Well, good evening. Thank you very, very much for joining us. It's our first subscriber event, live for subscribers of The Australian, since before COVID-19 came along and changed all of our lives. So we really appreciate your presence tonight. Thanks for sticking with us, and thanks for being subscribers to The Australian. We could not do what we do without you. Your support is absolutely critical, not only financially, because you've all got your credit cards out and put your money where your mouth is to support journalism, but also because we hold dear to our hearts the obligation that we have to you, our audience. We know exactly what you read. We sometimes sweat on the things that you're not clicking on, but we love every day that you tell us what you like and what you don't. There's nowhere to hide in the new age of digital journalism where we can see exactly what people are reading. And it inspires us every day to do better and to give you more of the content that you want. And something I think that we've learned in the advent of digital journalism is that what audiences want is real journalism. Investigations, deep dives, sorry, I hate that phrase, that's a terrible phrase. Really deep, considered, analytical journalism about everything, whether it's sport or politics or crime. I'm joined, of course, by Hedley Thomas. I'm not going to pretend that the reason you're all here is because this is about the front. Even though I hope you're all starting your days with The Front, which is our daily news podcast. Hedley has been roped in many times to be a guest on The Front, not only to inflate my listener numbers, but because, of course, he is always at the centre of the news agenda. So, Hedley, it's been a few months since I've seen you in the office. I know you've been very, very busy at your home in Queensland, and I think you've become you've become a primary producer.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Thank you everyone for coming. My wife and I moved to a place in Upper Brookfield in Brisbane where there's enough ground to support a couple of small cows. And so we bought 2 heifer calves. They're 8 months old and they're absolutely gorgeous, and where people mostly send cat videos, I send cow videos to friends. They're very mild-mannered, they eat out of my hand, and they're enjoying rolling around in the grass underneath the mango trees, so it's been a special time. It's caused me to be a little bit slow out of the blocks in writing a book that a publisher has been anticipating for a while. But just a week and a half ago, I did start writing it, so it's underway. And I did a little bit this morning in Surrey Hills, and I've only got about 90,000 words to go.
Every time I talk to Hedley, he's either standing in front of the fridge taking slices of mortadella or out in the paddocks feeding the cows. So I'm not quite sure when this book is going to appear, but I do. You are capable of hitting a deadline. So, yeah. Like most journalists, I often just think deeply about things and kick the can down the road until shortly before deadline, and then we write like crazy and manage to smash it out, and it kind of works. So I don't know how management handles the vagaries of journalism, but we get through it. Hedley, I think the day that everybody in this room can remember clearly is the day that Christopher Michael Dawson was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Lynette Sims. I remember that day very vividly, and I remember being absolutely terrified myself that we were not going to get the verdict that we were hoping for, but you were claiming to be calm and confident. How did you actually feel?
Well, I was claiming to be calm, but I wasn't calm, but I was confident that there would be a guilty verdict. One, because it was the right verdict, and I'd believed that for the previous 4.5 years. But 2, because the way that the evidence had been unfolding, the brilliant job that the prosecutor Craig Everson did, I think utter failure of the defence to meet all of the arguments that were raised in relation to Chris Dawson's lies, repeated lies that showed a consciousness of his own guilt, and the very powerful circumstantial case that had been built through an excellent police investigation that finished with Damien Loon handing over to Daniel Poole to complete. As we know, the first 20 years or so of the Dawson case was marred by dreadful police investigation, but they came good. And finally, when the DPP agreed that it would prosecute, and that decision was only made as the 16th episode of the podcast came out in December 2018, we got here. But that was a long time ago. I mean, if you remember the original podcast, 2018, it's been 5 years since then. And there are a lot of thrills and spills as Chris tried to dodge a prosecution and come up with lots of explanations and arguments as to why he should never face trial.
On many of the days when we go to court expecting a verdict, it's over in 5 minutes, and you can rush back to the office or have a coffee and stand around outside court talking about how you knew it was going to go that way, and then go back to the office and file your story. In this instance, we sat there for 5 hours and listened to Justice Harrison read his reasons for convicting Christopher Dawson. How were those hours for you?
Well, they're just excruciating, but I remember, because I was sitting with Marilyn and Greg Sims, Greg, of course, being Lynn's brother, and Marilyn and I were sort of holding hands tightly, and then more tightly when the judge would say things that seemed to be good for Chris.
Yes.
And then we'd sort of relax the grip a little bit and, just be gentler with each other when he was saying things in his summing up in his decision that we thought went against Chris and were good for a result. But towards the end, it really became clear that this is the way it was going. And we should have known, even though the judge went back and forth, but we should have been absolutely certain of a guilty verdict within the first minute or so, because Justice Ian Harrison said early on that Lynn Dawson, in his finding, had died on or about 8 or 9 June. And that meant that Chris Dawson's claims to have been talking to Lynn for weeks afterwards were a complete fabrication, were a lie. For the judge to have said that so early on was, the sign, the clue that he had to be guilty, but it took a long time for us to get there. And I know in the overflow court, because I've spoken to a number of people who were there, there was an enormous outpouring of emotion and cheering, and strangers were hugging each other. And I think that's an indication of the impact that this case had on many people who didn't know Lynn but felt they did.
Yeah, I remember at that moment, very early in the judgment, when Justice Harrison said that he found that Chris Dawson had lied about his last encounter with Lynn. Dave Murray, who was sitting next to me, we were all wearing masks, so everything was completely muffled. Dave said, "He's gone." And I didn't believe it. I wasn't ready to believe it yet. And I then focused all my stress and anger on Dave and began to find him incredibly annoying for the next 4.5 hours. The way he types, everything about him, the way he was wearing his mask. But yeah, it was immensely stressful. And then we had to come back and do it all again on the day of sentence. And of course, Christopher Dawson was sentenced to 24 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 18 years, which of course may be irrelevant, because something else that was achieved thanks to the power of our masthead, and that's only because of the audience, was a no body, no parole law that was passed in New South Wales, under pressure largely from Hedley, which means that if Chris Dawson doesn't reveal where that body is, he will never be released from prison. It's unlikely he will ever see the outside again. So how important was it to you to get that piece of legislative reform for Lynn's family and for Chris to get real justice?
Yeah, I thought it was a really important reform, and it was championed by Damien Loon, who had begun investigating Lynn's case in 1998 as a DY detective. It was championed as well by Bev Staniforth, the second babysitter in the Dawson household. And I think I sort of came onto the campaign fairly late, but because there was so much focus upon me after the verdict, I was able to give the idea a lot more push and momentum in interviews that I was doing with Koshi on 7 and pretty much in every interview that I was doing. And it obviously got picked up, and Dave Murray, my very good friend in Brisbane, he was ringing around talking to victims support groups and also the opposition and the Premier's office, and they were hearing it, and they must have been getting feedback as well from constituents, and they agreed that it was a very solid idea. It should be done, and it was done.
The original Teacher's Pet has reached 80 million downloads around the world, which probably means it's the biggest piece of journalism ever produced in Australia, I would say. I can't think of anything else. Thanks to the support of, in large part, Katie Page and Jerry Harvey, who I'd like to acknowledge, who are here tonight. We were able to also make the Teachers' Trial, which itself reached an absolutely enormous audience. It's well over 8.5 million downloads now for that podcast alone. So something that I think, Hedley, you have seen in the time since you began the Teacher's Pet as a novice podcaster is the renaissance of storytelling in an audio form. Once upon a time, this was a radio play. And in fact, the Teacher's Trial was like a radio play. We had voice actors and sound effects and doors opening and closing and, it's wild, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I look back on the start of the Teacher's Pet, and I'm really glad that my second cousin Rob Lowenthal's here, because Rob was right into the podcasts, and he was encouraging me to do one. My wife Ruth was very keen for me to do one, and in late 2017 when I started, I didn't know how you would go about doing it, and probably that's one of the reasons why the Teacher's Pet became a listen that people could relate to. The story was so important, the injustice was so obvious, but I didn't understand the rules and conventions of so-called, the right way of podcasting, because I hadn't done it before. So I just did it the way I thought I should write a long story, perhaps as a book, an audio book, with episodes unfolding like chapters. And the only difference was this was a live book. The Teacher's Pet ran out of, I ran out of episodes after about the 4th or 5th, but I had to keep producing them week after week. I made probably the right call before we launched to just start before I'd finished writing the series, and it was the right call because it ended up putting enormous pressure on us, and it led to enormous amounts of information coming in that became part of later episodes. But it was looking back, it was a completely insane, risky decision, because we could have completely blown it and not had the material to keep the feed going. But I think because it was live, because information was pouring in from people who were listening to the early episodes, and then I was incorporating that information into episodes 3 and 4 and 5, it meant that more listeners came on because they knew this was something that was developing in real time. That they felt like they were involved in an investigation that they could actually, it wasn't in the past, it wasn't in the rear vision mirror, they were there in the moment and following it week to week and sharing it. And so I think that really contributed enormously to the tips and evidence that we didn't know about that came in.
Yeah, you were a novice podcaster, and that was part of the charm of the Teacher's Pet, I think, that that you could tell Hedley didn't quite know how to work all the fancy audio gear, or maybe didn't have any fancy audio gear. But you were
both.
But you were working with another novice in Slade Gibson,
yeah,
who was the guitarist in Savage Garden.
Yeah.
But
literally
for the first time, he's literally a rock star, but he's a very reclusive rock star, isn't he?
Yeah, and he just, if he knew that we were calling him a rock star from Savage Garden, he'd be going, "Oh, not that again, can you not?" Yeah, but he's a sound engineer, a beautiful musician. He composed all the musical scores in The Teacher's Pet and worked so hard, did an amazing job, and has great judgment as well. Like, sometimes, perhaps as a result of fatigue, you're writing an episode, you're producing the episode, and I'm over in Slade's studio, as I almost lived there for much of 2018, and you come up with ideas that seem good at the time to lighten some of the really dark material. And Slade calls them my dad jokes, and he says, no dad joke in this one. No, we're not doing that. And he just cuts them out, you know. And he said, I've made an executive decision, and he was always right. His judgment is excellent. So I was incredibly grateful, and I've done every podcast since with Slade. The Night Driver and Shandy's Story, and you know, he's just the best.
In the last iteration, the last two podcasts we've done together, The Teacher's Trial and Shandy's Legacy, I tried to teach Hedley how to use Google Docs so that we could all share a script and all be looking at the same thing, which was fine until you got stressed, which was usually on Friday night at 9 o'clock. We were trying to release this thing so it was in everyone's podcast player by dawn on Saturday. And when Hedley got stressed, the Google Docs shared script with all my lovely colour coding and everything would completely go out the window, and we get 17 emails in a row with edits, which was causing a few people. There was a lot of stress going on.
Well, Google Docs just keeps changing. Yes.
That's the point.
Yeah. It's never in a solid state. You just, you know, I can't follow it. So I think you young ones can sort of handle it. It's not for me.
Slade Gibson loved the Google Docs innovation and told me at the beginning it wasn't going to work, and I tried anyway. But Slade is amazing with a metaphor, and one of the metaphors he came up with for working with Hedley, and it was, and this is not a comment on you, but more on the way the journalism was unfolding as they were making the podcast, was that he was laying down the railway tracks while the train was approaching, which I love as an image.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Yeah, he's got some great lines. I've used a few of them and taken the credit for them in the podcast.
So, of course, the podcast that you moved on to after The Teacher's Pet was The Night Driver, the incredibly harrowing story of a small town where a great crime had been committed and nobody had been brought to justice. How do you feel looking back at The Night Driver? What have you learned since making that podcast?
Yeah, it's a remarkable case. Janine Vaughan's still unsolved disappearance and murder, some 20 years old. And, you know, I feel like we got pretty close, but there were a number of suspects, potentially, 5 or 6 real possibilities. And, you know, I think that the killer is probably amongst those, but amongst those 5 or 6. But where do you take that? And it's really hard to point the finger. And when I was doing that podcast as well, I had been through an absolutely grueling period of being tested under oath, 3 days in the witness box during Chris Dawson's stay proceedings. He was seeking a permanent stay on the grounds that the Teacher's Pet podcast meant that he couldn't get a fair trial. So I think that I was probably overcorrecting and bending over backwards to make The Night Driver as fair as possible to all parties, including known official suspects. And that was probably the right thing to do, but I might have been a bit too fair and not actually closed in on 1 or 2 who stood out. I think one of the good things that came out of that podcast was that the person that the town had turned on had effectively run out of the entire region, was a former police officer. He had been the deputy mayor of that town, and because of the conduct in large part of a taxi driver who had at every opportunity accused this officer of being a murderer. You know, his reputation was completely ruined. He had PTSD. I think he had a terrible time. And with my friend, retired Judge Peter Murphy, who joined with me in the podcast, we came to a view that it was very unlikely that former officer, had anything to do with Janine's disappearance. So we didn't find the killer, but we might have helped ease the burden of someone who had been wrongly accused for many years.
So do you think you were second-guessing yourself or pulling your punches because the Dawson process was at that time so traumatic?
Yeah, I think certainly the latter. And I think we were also in a weird place. It was being done with, initially I was doing that podcast with a documentary team, And then COVID struck. And I remember being in Bathurst and suddenly, the world seemed to just, come to a standstill. Everyone was in a complete panic, and we were told to quickly, leave, go back to Sydney, Brisbane, wherever we were from, and bunker down. And, for about 3 weeks, I think most of us had sort of doona days, right? We just stayed under the doona, and that disrupted the flow of all of it. But I've still got some hope that we can crack the case with the night driver, and there are some very promising leads that have been coming up again and again. And I was only talking over the weekend with a source who is going to join me in the next, hopefully next month or so, with some ground penetrating radar equipment in an area of Bathurst that we've narrowed down and have a very strong witness observation about. And I don't want to get hopes up about that because it could come to nothing, but it's something that we'll run down, and touch wood, there'll be something to come out of it.
Yes, I think something you guys won't know is that Hedley is notorious within the Australian as an expense maverick. So I'm expecting a big bill for a ground penetrating. How much does that cost? Do we have to buy it?
Actually, I haven't inquired about the cost. Yeah, I'm also well known for being hopeless with getting my expenses reconciled on time, such that I get lovely feedback and commendations even from Lachlan Murdoch, but my corporate credit card's been cancelled. I can't use it.
It's very convenient. I think it's I always have to have mine on hand when I'm hanging out with you. So when I had one of my jobs, I'm editorial director of The Australian, which means my job is to bring big projects to life. And I'd not been back at the paper long when you rang me up and told me that you had a short and sweet investigation that you were going to do before the Dawson trial kicked into gear about a missing woman called Shandy Blackburn. And it was not going to take long. It would be over in 3 months, and it would be done and dusted. So how did that go?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an incredible case. And Shandy's murder on the streets of Mackay, a town that I know well and love because I got to know my wife and her family largely in Mackay. Her case has just developed into the most incredible revelation of not just the failures in the way her case was investigated, but in many dozens, possibly hundreds, even thousands of cases because of systemic issues with Queensland's DNA testing laboratory. And for anyone here who's listened to the evidence in that case and the incredible work of Dr. Kirsty Wright, a forensic biologist who joined with me very early in the piece, and it was just a complete fluke that I was able to find someone of the calibre, integrity and intelligence of Kirsty Wright. And what she's uncovered in relation to, I think it's not going too far to call it the corrupting of science and of forensic analysis in a laboratory which had one job, which was to find the DNA of killers and rapists and other serious criminals. And the DNA in many crime scene samples was always there, but the lab was reporting no DNA detected because they were not properly testing it. And Kirsty figured out that's why the forensics in Shandy's case failed so utterly, and that's why Kirsty predicted so many other cases would be affected, and they were. And as a result of Shandy's story and 20 episodes that we produced, I thought it was going to be short and sweet, but 20 episodes, grueling episodes, many episodes actually that probably have a bigger impact on listeners than anything else because the audio in them is incredibly raw. You hear in those episodes 000 calls from a man who's clearly frantic while trying to save Shandy. She's dying on the road beside him. You hear the reactions that have been recorded by police of Shandy's mother and her stepfather when they're being woken up about 4 a.m. by the police, knocking at their door, telling them that Shandy has died. And all of that material provided for the podcast. Shandy's mother knew how raw it would be and gave her blessing to me to use it. But it makes an enormous difference. In fact, one of the things I was thinking about just recently is that in both The Teacher's Pet, where I had a huge amount of material from the original inquests and the police brief, material that journalists wouldn't normally get, as well as in Shandy's story where I had a hard drive, gigabytes of documents from both the committal proceedings and the murder trial, and then the subsequent inquest, all of the witness statements, all these audio files that I'm referring to. I don't think it's a coincidence that both those podcast investigations have had the impact that they've had. It's because of the amount of material that we had access to. And it just begs the question, if journalists were able to access from government agencies, from police, from the coroner's offices, more material than is usually provided, how many more unsolved, how many more cold cases could be solved? It's the transparency in relation to this material that I think has given us these breakthroughs. If we don't have that documentation, it's very hard to find new leads, new evidence, new witnesses.
One of the reasons I think often that courts are reluctant to give us information is that they don't trust us to use it responsibly. There's a great deal of suspicion and fear of the media from the judicial system. You and I have talked about that a lot. In making decisions about the use of material like, for example, that 000 call or that police audio of Vicky Blackburn reacting to finding out her daughter was dead, an incredibly intimate moment, how did you navigate your way through the sensitivities of those things, given that the way people consume podcasts is really as entertainment?
Yeah. Well, when I heard those particular pieces of audio for the first time, the 000 call with Ringo Tapham, just so hysterical and worried for this girl that he didn't know had fallen down outside his flat. And when I heard the audio of Vicky, I wasn't sure how I would feel using the material. It was just so raw and moving, and for many times I listened to it, and even now, it makes me quite sad and distressed. So for Vicky, it was always going to be, I thought, a huge challenge. But she didn't blink. She just understood that impact from this material, while it would be incredibly difficult for her, it would hopefully trigger more people to be giving her and me help, information. The first part of the point you made, Claire, which was about authorities being concerned that we won't use this material responsibly, and that's why they don't want to give it. I think that's part of it. I also believe that some agencies believe that if we do make headway with material that they haven't been able to develop, then that'll reflect badly on them. So I think there's some self-interest in their failure or their refusal to allow us that material. They don't want to be, there's almost a bit of territorial jealousy, and so that's why it's often not coming directly from police, this material. It's coming from other sources, and it's perfectly legitimate. No one's stolen it or anything, but I've found in my career probably the most tight-lipped, the worst informants are the cops. They don't tell me much at all, but I've been fortunate to have very good sources elsewhere.
When we were deciding to make Shandy's Legacy, which was a podcast about the inquiry that was called in Queensland into what had been going wrong at the DNA lab, we had to deal with a slightly different problem, which is that this was going to be incredibly dense scientific material that, I didn't understand. that we were going to have to distill and condense for our audience and make it entertaining. So I can't remember now. How did we get through this?
Well, we had David Murray to understand it, and we had Matt Condon to make it, more digestible.
More lyrical.
But I think working with Claire, Matt, and Dave through Shandy's legacy and also through the teacher's trial, it was a completely different format because I'd been used to working on my own, and then having that team spirit and all of the goodwill and then I think chemistry that we developed and the friendship and rapport that we had, it was really nice. And we got through some very tough weeks and then months. It was grueling because at the same time as the Shandy inquiry was unfolding, we had Chris Dawson related podcasts to do. I was also re-narrating the original The Teacher's Pet because of course it came down in early 2019, after Chris Dawson was charged. The Australian and News Corp agreed to a request from the DPP that it come down in Australia. It played around the world unchanged. But when the verdict was delivered, there was a really powerful push in our company, for good reasons, to get this story back up as soon as possible. And because of some outstanding legal issues in relation to an upcoming trial in just a few months, we had to make some changes. And I realised that bleeping the changes would make the episode sound like, a Manhattan, traffic jam and peak hour. And so it had to be re-narrated instead of bleeped. I had to change, make sure that I didn't mention certain names throughout every episode. So it was better just to start from the top. It's probably a better production quality now as a result, but it was a grueling period and we had so many balls in the air. And we ended up going to Noosa for a few days just to focus on the findings from the inquiry, from Shandy's legacy. And we were able to let our hair down, but we put in some long hours there as well.
We had a battle in covering that inquiry with the instinct to suppress. Didn't we? I mean, there was, of course, the implications of the Shandy story are immense for every crime that's been committed in Queensland in probably the past couple of decades. And so there was a great deal of concern from various parties represented at the inquiry that we were going to trample all over cases that were very sensitive and where there may have been some form of miscarriage of justice. We had to brief counsel and be represented at that inquiry. How do you feel about the fact that we have to go in and fight for ourselves so hard like that?
Yeah, I think that when those sorts of issues arise, responsible news outlets like ours and others, they get on the front foot. And we are lucky that we've got very good media lawyers who are prepared to swing the bat and go in and state our case. And we did that, and a lot of that would go unreported. It probably wasn't even featured in the podcast or only lightly in the paper that we would have spent a very large amount of money, not Claire and I personally, but Lachlan Murdoch.
But you don't have a credit card, so.
And that was done to make sure that we can deliver as much information as possible and not be bound by orders that we disagree with. I think the Shandy inquiry, or the DNA inquiry as it was called, was run really well, as was the murder trial. You had very experienced judges in Ian Harrison, and then in Queensland, Walter Sofronoff, KC, a former president of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal. And that order that we got overturned or varied was the right way to go. But he delivered an amazing report, and his cut-through analysis of what had gone wrong in that lab, which we were able to reproduce in the podcast episodes, was, I think, just a masterclass of forensic legal analysis with a team of lawyers that worked really hard over several months. And it's going to restructure, completely revolutionise forensic testing in Queensland, and it's already led to a number of crimes that would have otherwise gone unsolved, being, really serious crimes, being identified with dangerous criminals who had just filtered back into the community, now facing the strong probability of trial and conviction.
In a moment, I'm going to open the room to questions because we're here to answer your questions. I don't think you're going to have any for me. I think they're all going to be for Hedley. That's fine. I won't be offended. So we'll have microphones that are going through the room, so please put your hands up. I'll just ask you one more question before we do that, so everyone can get their questions ready, Hedley. You made some really fiery comments during the Chris Dawson trial about a judgment that had been made, not in that trial, but in another court along the way, which had been extremely critical of you and of the teacher's pet. You took that extremely personally, and you said that judges should stay in their lane, which I think gave our lawyers a heart attack at work. What were you talking about?
Yeah, I was talking about the findings that were delivered in 2020 but were suppressed for almost about 2 years in relation to the stay proceedings that Chris Dawson had brought, where a large part of his argument was that he couldn't get a fair trial because the police investigation had been inadequate and incompetent, and significantly because of the Teacher's Pet podcast and the enormous public interest and the number of downloads that it had. And the judge in that case certainly took a very dim view of the reporting that I did. I was in the witness box in her court for 3 days, and that was an interesting trial. I definitely benefited from Dave Murray's advice and taking these little blue pills called beta blockers, and just to manage your nerves. There's nothing unlawful about them, but they kept me calm when I was not calm. Well, I would not have otherwise been calm. But the criticisms were broadly that I had seriously compromised the potential for Chris Dawson to get a fair trial, because I had interviewed witnesses who were the friends of Lynn Dawson, people who knew Chris Dawson, people who were at school with Chris Dawson's student who became his second wife. I had interviewed these people for the podcast. I had recorded my interviews with them. I had spoken to the family. I had even, she said, impugned, the office of the DPP for its failure to prosecute, and made, in her view, too much of the fact that the former DPP had been in the football team that Chris Dawson coached and was school captain of the school at which Chris and Paul Dawson taught. And those facts, for example, were not even in the public arena until we published them. And we didn't make a big deal of those facts, but we thought they were very relevant. As a journalist, I find it really interesting that here's a cold case that had been, to the time I started the podcast, 36 years unsolved. The family believed it would never be solved. They strongly encouraged the work that I was doing. The witnesses, so-called witnesses, well, they were witnesses to whom I spoke, were not witnesses for any upcoming murder trial when I spoke to them, because there was no charge. There was no anticipated murder trial. They were witnesses some 20 years earlier when police took statements from them for inquest proceedings held in 2001 and 2003. So how were they, going to affect things now? And I took the view when I started the Teacher's Pet and when I was facing that stay proceeding that it was now or never. This case was probably going to die unsolved if we didn't have a really strong push at trying to get some new evidence, trying to flush out witnesses who hadn't spoken before, and make the authorities understand that perhaps they had made a really poor error of judgment in the past in repeatedly refusing to prosecute this case. And I feel that that's my job as a journalist, and that's the job of every journalist to do that. And you know, when I said that judges should stay in their lane, it was probably partly because I didn't appreciate the idea that judges, in delivering their reasoned views or their rulings, think that they have some pompous right to tell journalists how to practice journalism. They don't do that. They shouldn't do that. I don't tell a judge how to, you know, deliver rulings. I wouldn't have a clue. So that's what that was about. Yeah.